Good afternoon. Welcome to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy webinar, Hunger in the U.S., How Disasters Disrupt Access to Food. And today we're going to talk about the long-term hunger crisis in the U.S. And while not on the same scale as perhaps the famine in Sudan, which we'll address next month, it's still a crisis for millions of Americans who have to choose between feeding their kids and paying their bills. My name is Tanya Gulliver Garcia. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm the Director of Education and Advisory Services at the Center for Disaster Philanthropy. Growing up, my dad worked at Canadian General Electric, or CGE, and he often experienced strikes and layoffs. My parents had both grown up in London during World War II and experienced food rationing and food stamps. And as a result, we always had an extraordinary amount of food. But yet a scarcity mindset also caused my mom to reduce food volume whenever my dad was off work. Shortly after this picture that you see here, I ran away from home. I spent a little while houseless, and then I managed to get student welfare and rent a room to attend my last year of high school. But for the next 5 years, I was often homeless or unstably housed and regularly dealt with food insecurity. Back then, there were no school feeding programs, so lunch consisted of finishing whatever my friends didn't eat. There were also new food banks. Hunger wasn't something that really crossed people's mind back then. Living in New Orleans, I continued to see the effects of Hurricane Katrina, which occurred 20 years ago this summer. The loss of grocery stores has meant that the best access to food is at the local gas station or Dollar General, which means lots of fried chicken, white bread, and processed food. I want to give a few housekeeping notes before we get started. There is live captioning. You can click on closed captions or live transcript to access it, and it's available in multiple languages. We are recording the webinar, and it may be available on our website and YouTube channel later. When you finish the webinar, there's going to be a short survey. Please complete this to help us improve our webinar offerings and to better meet your needs as a viewer. And there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please use that at any time to ask a question, and we'll answer that at the end of the panel presentation. I want to thank our sponsors, and we have lots of them today. Alliance Magazine, Council on Foundations, Giving Compass, National Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters, Peak Grant Making, Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems Funders, the Funders Network, and United Philanthropy Forum. And a real shout out to our co-sponsors because their support enables us to reach a broader audience of funders and attendees. And as we begin the webinar, CDP acknowledges that it works on the stolen lands of the many original peoples. We recognize that Indigenous peoples have been displaced and disenfranchised from their land by the social, economic, and cultural impacts of colonialism and disaster. The erasure of Indigenous knowledge about how to care for these lands has caused environmental destruction and degradation. CDP is committed to dismantling the ongoing legacy systems and structures of settler colonialism and white supremacy and their connections to philanthropy today and in the future. Despite centuries of theft, violence, and murder, this is still and always will be Indigenous land. Please join us in acknowledging the original people and their elders, past, present, and future generations. A few goals we have for this webinar. We hope that you will be better able to understand the systemic causes of hunger and how to address them. You'll recognize the repercussions of funding cuts, and we will talk about that because there was a big one this week. And we will explore how funders can reduce hunger in the US. When you joined, you were asked a couple of poll questions. So to what extent are you aware of the hunger crisis? Looks like the majority of people, 63%, said they're aware, 27% said fully aware, and a small handful not unaware or not aware. We hope all of us will learn, even if we're quite aware, as we talk to our speakers today. I know I learned a lot in the planning. And then we also asked, what do you think is the most significant cause of food insecurity in the US? I know this is a perhaps hard question because it's hard to just choose one. But we see that poverty came in first at 33%, systemic barriers to opportunity at 31%, and then high cost of food and high housing expenses at 12%. And I think those are, fairly understandable and very interconnected. I want to start with a couple definitions about words and concepts that you'll hear, and you can see the definitions of both hunger and food insecurity on the screen. But I want to point out that hunger doesn't affect everyone the same. Feeding America says millions of people in America are just one job loss, missed paycheck, or medical emergency away from hunger. Some groups, like children, communities of color, rural communities, women, and people with disabilities, just to name a few, face hunger at much higher rates. And I think this was something that became very clear during COVID. A few statistics about hunger. In the US in 2023, 13.5% of people were food insecure, and that's an increase from 2022. When you talk about that in numbers, it's 47.4 million people in this country. And for children, 1 in 5 kids is facing hunger, or 14 million children. In 2023, people who were food secure, those food secure households, spent 16% more on food than insecure households of the same size and composition. And 58%, I was really surprised by this number, of food insecure households participated in USDA's Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, which we'll hear about today, the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, better known as WIC, and the National School Lunch Program in just the 1 month before they took that survey in 2023. And some information from that USDA report, you can see here on the screen that the darker blue is people who are food secure. The middle color blue is people who have low food security. And the very pale blue, at least on my screen, are folks with very low food security. And this shows that very low food security had the highest number of people across the board experiencing the different categories, including skipping meals, shrinking their portions, or just being unable to afford the prices. And now I want to introduce our special guests. I am so excited to talk to this panel. Salam Bhatti is the SNAP director at the Food Research and Action Center, where he and his team work to protect and strengthen SNAP. He previously worked as a public benefits attorney for the Virginia Poverty Law Center and led efforts to expand SNAP, repeal the drug felony ban, and expand access to free school meals. Vince Davis is an internationally recognized emergency manager, master exercise practitioner, author, consultant, and advocate for underserved, marginalized communities. He's held numerous roles in the military, government, disaster relief, and corporate sectors, and currently serves as the Senior Director of Disaster Services for Feeding America. Vince is the author of several books, including this one, Empowered and Prepared, the Disaster Resilience Guide for Black Communities, which I just read this week. Highly recommend it to all of you. And then Kavita Kopa is the co-executive director at RAFI, a farm advocacy organization based in North Carolina. She has worked for 15 years in agriculture, both on the ground and at the kitchen table, to help farmers thrive. She hails from South Carolina, is proud of her immigrant roots, and loves a good spreadsheet. So welcome to each of you, and thank you for taking time to share your expertise with us. Vince, I'm going to start with you. Even though the US is a very wealthy country, we still have very high rates of hunger and poverty. Why do you think that is? And what are the implications of that for people in disasters?
Sure, Tanya, and thank you so much for having me on the panel. It may surprise a lot of people, but even in one of the world's wealthiest nations, that we have over 34 million people, many of them children that are experiencing some form of food insecurity. And that number grows after every disaster. So when there's a big disaster, it's not just the 34 million. It may be a subset of them that are impacted, but it also may be additional people that were not previously food insecure. Going back to what you said with regard to, one paycheck or one catastrophe away from food insecurity. So, you know, we don't have a lack of food or money in this country. What we have is just systemic gaps that prevent the resources from reaching the people who need them the most. Uh, why is that? I mean, generations of structural, inequity, racism, underinvestment, and economic dislocation, uh, housing instability, high healthcare costs, low wage work. Uh, these issues are compounded with the disasters themselves because disasters don't hit equally. What they do is expose where the safety net has holes and they widen the gap that already exists. So you can't expect, as I said before many times, a single mom to pack up 2 cans of tuna and some crackers and take some extra cash and shove it under the bed to prepare for something that hasn't happened. Because if you tell her that, she's going to say, if I've got 2 cans of tuna and some crackers, that's going to be dinner for my kids tonight. And if I've got some extra cash, that's going to be money to get the bus to my minimum wage job. So, what does this mean for donors in particular? Donors can do more to provide relief and they can change outcomes. And when you invest in resilience, things like pre-stage food and water, mobile outreach teams and disasters, community-led disaster hubs, you're not just responding to a crisis, but we're responding to suffering before it begins. I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but the role of philanthropy and preparedness is to fill those critical gaps between government resources and community needs and the public. And with donor support, Feeding America, for example, has staged disaster supplies in vulnerable regions throughout the country and helped many food banks get back online within hours, not weeks. So,
Wow, that's really great. And I think of what you said is now we're hearing in emergency management that instead of just being prepared for 3 days or 72 hours to shelter at home, that we might need to be prepared for 120 hours or 5 days. And how do we save that food and water, as you said, for that single mom?
absolutely.
Salam, let me go to you. You said when we talked that you are in the fight for your lives right now. So talk a little bit about, SNAP generally, what it does to prevent food insecurity or doesn't do, but, what happened this week?
Yeah, thanks, Tanya, and thanks everybody for joining, taking time out of your day to talk about this. At the Food Research and Action Center, we've been working for over 50 years to protect and strengthen the federal nutrition programs so that we can not only end poverty-related hunger, but also ultimately work ourselves out of jobs. Unfortunately, what happened this past week with the House Ag Committee, we've got more job security than we'd ever want. So one of the things that I'll quickly address is what happened. What happened is that there were three major cuts that are adding up to upwards of $300 billion of cuts from SNAP, which is the largest cut in program history. It effectively will destroy the program, and here's why. Three of the big three cuts are this. One is changing the time limits. People also call these work requirements, but we call them time limits because it's putting a time limit on a basic human need. And what this time limit is it's for able-bodied adults without dependents. That acronym is ABOD. So able-bodied adults without dependents typically means people who are fit for work and don't have kids. What this change does, is it increases the upper age from 54 to 64. So it's saying that if you are between the ages now of 18 to 64, you have to work 80 hours a month. Otherwise, you can only get SNAP for 3 months out of a 36-month period. If that's confusing, it's meant to be confusing. It's not natural. This is not scientific. It's not mathematically based. It's all policy made from people who are trying to get the least government spending on this. So this increase from 54 to 64 is estimated to remove 3 million older adults from the program at a time when they have no income because they don't have a job, and they're going to need food assistance, and now they will no longer be able to receive food assistance. So it's not removing 3 million people who no longer need the program. It's going to remove 3 million people who especially need the program. Another change that is anticipated is the definition of children is being changed. Right now, a child that counts for dependents is under the age of 18. This changes it to the age of under 7. So what the committee proposes is, if you're a single parent and your child is under 7, or rather, if you're a single parent and your child is over 7, then you should be working 80 hours a month so that you can continue to be eligible for SNAP after those 3 months. Now you think about, well, how many parent-friendly jobs are out there? How many single parent-friendly jobs are out there? Not many. How many of them are going to be accommodating to when the kid suddenly gets sick, which my child is currently sick at home right now? How many of them are going to provide paid sick time? How many are going to be accommodating to when childcare doesn't work? And how many are going to pay enough so that you can afford childcare, which is so expensive? It's not a natural disaster. It's not a man-made disaster. This is a constant disaster that families in poverty are going through. And if this reconciliation package passes Congress in August, it's going to be chaos. Another proposed cut is to shift the costs from the federal government to the state. If you've ever worked in state advocacy or you've worked with state budgets, you know there's peanuts within the state general budgets to spend on anything else. State agencies are fighting over scraps. Every state agency is underfunded, understaffed. And what the federal government proposes to do is, or rather, what this committee is proposing to do is two things. One, the federal government provides a 50-50 match. There's a 50% match from the federal government, and the state puts in the other 50 for SNAP administration. This committee is proposing increasing the state share to 75% and the federal share down to 25%. There's also 100% of the SNAP benefit that's fully federally funded. The committee proposes at least 5% of that is going to be shifted to states based on their payment error rates. The higher the payment error, the higher that cost is going to shift, up to 25%. We've got some state fact sheets that show how much each state is receiving in SNAP benefits. And for some states, it's like $1 billion. For a 5% transfer to happen to the states, it's not going to be affordable. So what we anticipate with this happening is that states will pull back on state options and remove entire families from the SNAP program so that they can afford to do it for all those who are going to be in need on the default level. What this removal means is that children who are in these households, they will lose their direct certification for school meals, and the kids under 5 will lose their direct certification for WIC. So it's not just a ripple effect that these cuts are going to have. It's going to have a shockwave effect across the country. And then finally, moving forward, they're going to freeze the benefit adjustment through the Thrifty Food Plan. So this is projected to be a $37 billion cut moving forward over the next 10 years, which means that the SNAP benefit will lose its purchasing power. And so even though it'll increase every October due to the cost of living adjustments, the consumer price index, inflation adjustment, It's not going to adjust based on the current dietary guidelines. It won't adjust based on consumption patterns and based on what foods and beverages are available in the market at the time. So it will destroy the SNAP program and create a death by 1,000 cuts. But all that to say, what we have right now is a really efficient and effective program. SNAP helps over 42 million people put food on the table every single month. And this is critical because this program is helping so many people at a time when food insecurity is rising 3 years in a row. And we all know grocery prices are also at all-time highs and continuing to increase. Now, what SNAP doesn't do, it's a very minimal benefit. Well, I love asking people, hey, how much do you think the average SNAP benefit per person per day is? And recently I asked somebody and he said, I don't know, $80. It's $6.16 per person per day. And what SNAP doesn't do for the 48 states, it doesn't adjust based on the cost of living. So if you're living in Manhattan, which is a high cost of living, you're getting the same formulaic amount as somebody in Bristol, Virginia, which is a super rural area. So that's something that we can do something about, but we just haven't done yet. And we have legislation to at least increase the formula so that the benefit can be more adequate. So that's in a nutshell what we got.
Yeah, so a lot of changes this week, and I know when we talked earlier, we weren't sure what would happen and how this would all play out. So, and $6.16, I had no idea that that was the amount myself. So yeah, it's not very much, and these changes are really going to affect, I think, those lower income states already, and states that face lots of disasters like Texas and California and Louisiana. Or that have high rates of poverty, like Mississippi, Alabama. Kavitha, let me go to you. You know, I often hear that people think their food comes from a grocery store, but that's not really where it comes from. So can we talk about some of the structural issues facing farmers, debt capital, and how do disasters affect farmers?
Absolutely. Thank you, Tanya. I think one of the things that I both really love and sort of hate about agriculture at the same time is that it is foundational to how literally every single one of us lives in this world. And it is also so largely unseen. So part of what I want to talk about in response to your question is just illuminating a little bit of what it takes to actually be able to run a farm operation and therefore feed people. For folks who are not as familiar, most of agriculture is extremely dependent on a cycle of debt capital in order to operate. From season to season, if you think about it purely in terms of the cash flow perspective, a farmer is starting a season needing to purchase all of their inputs at the same time. They have to then use all of those inputs to put seeds in the ground, and then you have to wait for a long time before you're able to get anything out of the ground. And then you have to be able to sell it. And only then do you actually have an inflow of cash. So in order to, on a growing season kind of basis, pretty much the only way you can get through that is if you have a chunk of capital at the front end of the growing season in order to get started. So I really want to emphasize that farmers are extremely reliant on debt in some form in order to be able to do their jobs. Some of the other structural components to this process that I think are important to realize, because food does come from farms, it doesn't come from just the grocery store, are recognizing that land tenure is extremely tentative for a lot of folks. In order to be able to grow on your land year to year, you have to know that you have access to that land. And for the various reasons that Mr. Davis mentioned, that Salam had mentioned, there's a long history of not just discrimination, but systemic generational wealth loss and theft, particularly in the form of land. So especially in the work that Rafi does, we do a lot of work with folks of color and farmers of color in particular. So they are facing kind of the 2025 version of those accumulated issues over time in terms of being able to access their land. If you can't access your land, then you can't grow food on it. If you can't grow food on it, you can't feed people. So I think it's really important to make sure that farm infrastructure and these kind of basic levels of what farmers are facing are part of this conversation. The final component I wanted to share real quickly is that a lot of farmers are extremely dependent on government funding. One of the pieces of the entire world as it is right now that all of us are facing, particularly the US policy component that I want to highlight, is that several of the government programs that exist to support farmers to implement environmental practices on their farm, to be able to get that initial debt capital, regardless of what they're doing on their farm to start, have been severely cut. The programs themselves are in limbo. The actual staff to be able to operate those programs has been really decimated over the last several months. So farmers are in a really tough spot because not only are these cuts in place, it's May, it's the growing season. Like the timing of these things has also severely impacted the entire year for how farmers are operating, because they were expecting to be getting money in, they were expecting to get that debt in order to start the season, and have been halted in a huge way, particularly in 2025.
And that debt's really like you start working in February and you don't get paid till October. If we think about it as a normal salary.
And you have to wait all of that time and hope a disaster doesn't strike, because then that throws everything out of it. It's an extremely tenuous process.
And I know we talked about there's some other cuts, even about the guarantee of purchase for, feeding food banks and school lunches, and it's really a system. So what are you hearing from farmers on the ground? What are they talking about or most concerned about right now?
Definitely, it's a great question. I'm hearing a few different things. One, I'm hearing the need for infrastructure never ends. The ability to actually be able to, particularly for operations that are producing what are called specialty crops, which is food, as opposed to, grain for ethanol, things along those lines. Farmers are really needing on that baseline, literally in order to feed their communities, you have to have a place to wash the food. You have to have that basic infrastructure on your farm. It doesn't just end with I miraculously was able to have a bushel of zucchinis that made it through a hurricane that hit, right? There are several steps beyond that in order for that food to get in someone's mouth. We're also hearing naturally a lot of confusion around how to navigate the changes at the federal level, which I think we can say pretty safely. I think everyone is trying to figure out how to navigate changes at the federal level. And then to the point you had just brought up, Tanya, there were some of the federal funding cuts, which I'm sure folks are familiar here, specifically affected the ability to purchase local food for institutions. So whether those institutions are food banks, are schools, or hospitals, regardless of what the institution is in that particular way, the funding that was supporting farmers to be able to serve those markets has been cut. So we're seeing a lot of farmers whose markets have just evaporated for reasons that are beyond their understanding, and they're trying to figure out, because of that timeline I mentioned earlier, it's May, the money that they were hoping and expecting and on contract to receive in August is all of a sudden gone. So they're trying to figure out, how do I figure out where to sell all this food, assuming this food actually is able to withstand whatever the heck the next few months bring to us in terms of weather disasters. So that's a lot of the questions that I am hearing right now from our folks on the ground.
Yeah, and we know from our work that farmers and ranchers during a disaster often really experience a lot of stress, high suicide rates after disasters. And I think this kind of stress and cut is only going to add to, their mental health. And that's something we really need to think about as farmers' mental health as we approach this season.
100%.
Vince, let me go back to you. On our planning call, you said Feeding America is one of the only organizations that feeds people before, during, and after a disaster. Can you talk about the role of Feeding America in those stages?
Yeah, absolutely. General Russell Honore, who was one of the heroes of Hurricane Katrina 20 years ago, some of you may recall, he was the general that came in after all the chaos ensued, that said, "We're stuck on stupid and lower your weapons. It's not a war zone." General Honore said some years ago, people will fare after a disaster based on what they were doing before the disaster. Okay, so if you weren't doing anything to prepare for disaster, you're obviously not going to be prepared during a disaster. So what Feeding America does with our 200-member network of food banks and over 60,000 partner agencies or pantries is serve tens of millions of people every day during blue skies, as they say, when there's not a disaster. And that support helps these households remain somewhat stable so that when there's a disaster, they're not all over the place. They've got some kind of baseline of where they're getting food from. Then disaster preparedness. Our disaster services team pre-positions disaster food boxes, bottled water, and emergency supplies in high-risk regions. We provide training and readiness and exercise support for the partner food banks so that they can better prepare themselves. Because as we found out in Hurricane Helene, where we actually lost an entire food bank, the Manna Food Bank was completely destroyed and overwhelmed. The food banks themselves need to be more prepared to withstand the issues surrounding a disaster. And then collaborations with emergency management agencies, volunteer agencies active in disaster, corporate donors to align our logistics and planning. So that all happens before. What happens during a disaster? Rapid mobilization. Feeding America sort of flips our hat and becomes first responders based on the needs of the community, distributing meals and water, hygiene kits. This was done by, for example, the LA Regional Food Bank in California during the wildfires that hit California. They literally stepped up and went above and beyond to serve the people who were affected by the wildfires. What happens is strategic deployments during those disasters, lone staff, providing mobile distribution units, coordinating with state and federal agencies like FEMA and state emergency management agencies to ensure food and water reach hard to access areas. And then after the disaster, we're still there, again, because we've always been there. Extended relief, we continue distributions. There are food distributions going on in North Carolina months after all the fire trucks have left and all the media has left in North Carolina and Georgia and other places. Food banks are supporting displaced families and helping rebuild their own damaged facilities in some cases, and helping local nonprofits resume services. So there's a lot of resilience investments that go on. And most disaster organizations show up after an event. That's not a criticism, that's just the nature of their work. But our work puts us in a unique place to happen to have been the ones who were already there, already working in the community and already distributing food.
Thank you. And it's good to know that you have the whole range of services, because I think a lot of us think of food banks maybe more just, during a disaster to help people get more food, and but not all these other services that you're providing that I think are so important to that resilience you mentioned.
And each of our member food banks, by the way, are independent organizations, 501c3s. They operate independently in that they have their own CEO, their own infrastructure, but we work closely together with them at what we call the national office, because we're not a headquarters hierarchical organization. And our role here at the national office is to support them, support the members. So it works
great.
out very well, and it helps make us more efficient as an organization.
Absolutely. And we funded Feeding America during COVID just for that reason, that you could reach out to those local independent food banks better than we could. Salam, let me go back to you. How do families access benefits during a disaster or crisis? We were talking about ongoing before, but what happens during a disaster?
Yeah, there's two ways. So for those who are SNAP participants, if there were significant electricity outages, then SNAP participants will receive replacement benefits, typically automatically. Otherwise, if there wasn't that many, then they can manually request for benefit replacements. And then the second way is through disaster SNAP, also known as DSNAP. This is something that's available for people who are struggling through the disaster who are not eligible for SNAP, because SNAP participants may have already gotten their benefit replacements. Disaster SNAP is for those who are not eligible for SNAP but need something to help replace their food. DSNAP is not a first responder like Feeding America is. DSNAP begins operations once the commercial channels of food distribution resume. That means when the grocery stores have reopened, because that's how you're going to use the DSNAP benefit. You're going to get a card, an EBT card, and on that is loaded 1 month's worth of benefits per how many members of people are in your household. And so you can use that to at the grocery store, convenience stores, wherever EBT cards are accepted. And then also, one of the great things about DSNAP is that even though it's a 1 month program or a 1 month amount of benefits, participation in DSNAP means that your children would be eligible for free or reduced price school meals in the following school year. Not just for 1 month, but for the entirety of the school year. So that's great. What FRAC does when it comes to DSNAP is that we provide technical assistance to state advocates during the disasters, and then we advise them on what to do. For example, when Tennessee recently got hit by a hurricane, they hadn't really ever been hit by a hurricane. So the state advocate, who was very seasoned in SNAP, didn't know much about DSNAP. And the state agency didn't know much about DSNAP either. So what we did was we said, hey, here's some best practices of what you should request. And just see what happens. I come from the magic school bus school of thought, where we take chances, make mistakes, and get messy. And the chance we took was asking for automatic replacements under the guise of knowing that agency staff are also going through the disaster, right? The disaster hit them too. So we want to make sure we can get the best program that not only helps the people, but also decreases the administrative burden. So our state advocate, she requested the automatic replacements, and the state agency approved, took it on, and it got approved by USDA. So that was wonderful. We also provided technical assistance during that same hurricane to North Carolina and Georgia. Again, we had new advocates there, even though they've had a number of hurricanes. So providing them with our technical assistance, we were able to get a really good DSNAP rollout, and also some lessons learned so that we can improve for hurricane season, which is just around the corner. So this is important because there's a lot more states who are going to be experiencing disasters that haven't ever experienced it. I think Ohio had gotten hit by a hurricane. And with climate catastrophe happening as it is, billion-dollar disasters happening a lot more frequently, staff turnover happening at agencies and at anti-hunger organizations, it's really important that we continue providing this resource over at frac.org/disaster.
Thank you. And I think Katie put some links to the resources in the chat for everyone. And we will share all of those resources out at a later date on our website. I think back to Hurricane Ida and having to replace every single thing in my fridge after 8 days without power. And we just don't realize, oh, wait, I forgot mustard or I forgot ketchup, let alone the actual food that got lost that I had to replace. I have a question for everyone before we move to the Q&A that are fairly similar. So Vince, what are 3 things funders could do to help food banks?
So glad you asked that question. First and foremost, invest in resilience, not just in relief. And what I mean by that is most funding comes after a disaster, but food banks need support before so that they can prepare, they can stage supplies, and they can strengthen their infrastructure. So how funders can help us to support pre-disaster investments, things like backup generators, warehouse upgrades, pre-position food and water. So it's not just food, but it's helping shore up that infrastructure. They can fund readiness planning. Some of our donors have funded training and simulated exercises, the ability to practice before so that we can get smoother and better at it as we go along. And then provide multi-year flexible funding that allows food banks to build capacity before the next crisis hits. So that's one thing. The other thing is to support equitable access to food. Disasters hit hardest in already underserved communities, rural areas, communities of color, people with disabilities. How funders can help is to fund things like mobile distribution vehicles, back community-based partnerships with faith-based organizations, mutual aid groups, local lenders, and enable food banks to reach and serve people who may not qualify for federal aid. And then the last thing is to fund the people behind the response. Now, what do I mean by that? Behind every distribution is a team of people working long hours in very high stress conditions, often without surge staffing, wellness resources, disaster specific roles. We could use investments in personnel as far as things like disaster coordinators, logistics leads, mental health support was huge in North Carolina and Georgia following Helene. Mental health support for the workers who are working 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, uh, endlessly. So providing funds for loan staff programs to support the food bank's regional mutual aid deployments and things like that. And also supporting technology and tools that help streamline the response. We got a really great donation from one donor. I won't name names here because that's not what we're here for. Uh, but it allowed us a situational awareness tool that has really helped us become better at tracking pre-disaster weather events and other events. It's made a huge difference in our ability to be more precise about our responses. So those are just the three things that donors could do to help.
Yeah, three great things, very practical ideas, I think. So what about funders helping food insecurity overall? What could they do?
Yeah, two things here. In the realm of DSNAP, funding state or policy groups that will be on the front lines of requesting DSNAP, funding their education and advocacy and outreach would be super critical. And then secondly, just overall in the food insecurity space, funding diverse coalitions. And what this means is, I'll give an example. When I was at the Virginia Poverty Law Center, we were trying to introduce or implement broad-based categorical eligibility for SNAP, which colloquially we call SNAP expansion. If SNAP expansion happened, it would mean that 25,000 more families would be eligible for SNAP. And as great a program as this is, as great an idea as this is, as much money that it would bring into the state as it was always getting beat down on partisan lines. And I looked at our coalition and I saw it was really just anti-hunger advocates. So what we did was we expanded the coalition, we diversified, we included banks, we included health insurance companies and other community-based organizations. And when we came forward as a whole unit in agreement with this thing and providing, model legislation for it, that really helped perk up some ears. And a policy that would die on party lines in red and purple Virginia, all of a sudden passed unanimously. And that helped 25,000 families sign up for the program and bring in so much more federal funding into the state. And with every SNAP dollar having up to a $1.80 economic impact during a downturn, that's amazing. And not only just helping families put food on the table, but goes up the supply chain to helping the grocery stores keep their lights on, the truck driver transporting the food, the payment processors processing the SNAP payments, and the farmers who are growing the food. So it's a wonderful program and a great investment into a society. So definitely recommend funding diverse coalitions.
Yeah, that's a really great success story. We are going to ask one more question of Kavitha, and then we are going to go to our question and answer. So if you haven't had a chance, take this moment to put a question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Kavitha, when we were talking, you said disasters don't just happen to people who are hungry, they happen to the people who are growing the food. So how could funders help build up infrastructure to support farmers?
Absolutely. Thank you. I want to couch my answer in something that I'll own my bias in saying this. Uh, Farmers are really freaking resilient. They go through, they have to withstand changes in their world around them on a daily, hourly, minute by minute basis in a way that I think anyone who has not worked in agriculture, it is very difficult to even fathom what folks are doing in the first place, regardless of whatever services might be available. We work with farmers who have been working with each other to get through disasters, regardless of what nonprofit funder support might exist in the world. So I would say the kind of overarching theme of my response is let's figure out how we help farmers do what they do because they're already so powerful unto themselves and make their lives easier in that regard. There's a few different ways that this can look, in my opinion. One, and I appreciate someone had brought up Helene. So Raffi is based in North Carolina, and we had a very heavy rapid response to Helene. Um, in that, just to illustrate kind of where I'm going here, in that we had 5 folks on staff who ended up ultimately working one-on-one, doing deep casework and disaster recovery with 225 farmers in North Carolina and Georgia primarily. We implemented a 2-phase rapid response re-granting program to farmers to help them get money to do whatever the heck it was that they needed to do. I think the flexibility of that funding is absolutely crucial, recognizing that it is, particularly in the case of farmers, and I'm pretty sure in the case of all human beings, right? Very much a case by case basis of what folks are needing in that moment. So the flexibility of how to use those funds is crucial. The ability to do the long-term follow-up is also extremely important. Now we've gotten through the immediate disaster related to Helene, and we're shifting into in October, we're going to be coming up on a year. How are folks faring from a mental health perspective? How are folks faring in terms of what infrastructure has actually been built up or not? So recognizing there's a longevity in terms of the support that's needed, there's a flexibility in terms of the support that's needed, and then very much to echo what Salam had just mentioned, being able to fund an ecosystem of work is really important. We had a really strong network of people, not just with Helene, but with other disasters. We do a fair bit of work in Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, which obviously have a whole other experience when it comes to hurricane disasters, especially. So being able to recognize and push your support behind those those larger coalitions and ecosystems of organizations because each of them is hitting a different piece of the puzzle that is so important. Some people are going to be really great at interpreting and pushing policy changes related to disasters. Some people are going to be better at on the ground. You need to do all of them, and all of those folks need to be talking to each other. So being able to move funding in a direction that is supporting that sort of integration is crucial.
Yeah, that's really great. And it leads to one of the questions that somebody submitted in advance. And I'm going to alternate between the Q&A box and the questions. We only have a little bit, but we'll get through a few of them. Kavitha, let me ask you this question. It ties with what you were just saying is, how can we make more resilient and robust local food systems?
You said I only have a little bit of time to respond to this, so I will do my best. As I'm sure all of us
It's a
will take
5-day
that challenge
journey.
here.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Come on the trek with me, y'all. We've got a lot to talk about. I think that first and foremost, what is important is recognizing the different. Think of the entire value chain, right? Um, there's not just the aspect of how the food gets on a shelf, but there's also the component of things need to be processed, things need to be distributed. So much of that in between infrastructure is truly lacking. And support for it has also been lacking. I think that there's a huge opportunity for local farms to be so much and such a more robust part of disaster recovery and food insecurity on the whole. But it doesn't work if we're only thinking about the market component of the food system, right? So in terms of the support that's really needed, I think you have to start with what is the farmer facing on the ground? How do we get them to even be able to pull that food out of the ground? And then and then all the various steps that it takes for it to get on a shelf into someone's fridge, on and on and on. A lot of what we see, a lot of Rafi's approach, I think, to so much of this work is very much, we're very grounded in what farmers are telling us. We have run a regranting program for farmers for almost 30 years now. So we hear on a very regular basis the biggest needs that farmers are facing. And it almost always falls into that line. It's the, I can squeeze blood out of a turnip, right? And I can somehow magically create food out of dirt. But the problem is what happens after that point. How do I get this food to where it needs to go? How am I able to serve my communities? Because so many of the farmers that we work with very much value themselves as stewards and supporters and nourishers of their communities. But what comes after that point is crucial and underinvested and underseen.
Absolutely. Salam, I want to ask you a question that came in the chat. And it's asked about bringing in retailer or grocery store associations to advocate for SNAP. And really about, this ties in with a couple questions we received about supporting rural communities. And, you know, that SNAP seems to be a great way to invest in local economy and a win-win overall.
Yeah, and I totally forgot. Of course, we had a grocery in our groups and our diverse coalitions as well, including county and city organizations as well. And on a national level, we have seen hesitancy on like the national grocery whatever organizations out there. A couple are coming forward to protect SNAP, but there was hesitancy because they fear retaliation from the administration. But now there are some of them who are breaking out of the shell and understanding that this 20%, now it's even looking like a 30% cut on SNAP, will really impact their bottom line. And it might even result in them having to close their stores in rural parts of the country, especially. And if it's not closing their stores, if you're removing 30% of their bottom line, then they might need to increase their prices to offset the loss of those SNAP benefits. And if people who are already living paycheck to paycheck, who are not eligible for SNAP, can barely afford things as is, they're not going to be able to afford those higher prices. So then later on, then the domino effect means that those stores will probably have to close as well. So it's going to impact food insecurity in a bigger sense, which is why it's so impactful to really bring in as many people in to talk about why this program is so important.
Sure. I'm going to ask Vince one question and then have a question for all of you before we wrap up. Vince, somebody asked, do member food banks track trends in individuals seeking services? For example, normal operations versus post-disaster. And I know you've told me if I've seen one food bank, I've seen one food bank. So this may not be everyone, but what's that tracking like?
Say again, I'm not sure exactly where that was.
Sure.
Going.
Someone asked, do member food banks track trends in individuals seeking services? So normal operations compared to post-disaster.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, we look at, look at certainly disaster surge spikes in demand, how that impacts the quote unquote normal operations or blue sky operations, if you will. So we are constantly looking at those numbers so that we can see how the trends are going and what we need to shore up against. So yes, the answer is we use a lot of data and statistics. Matter of fact, data drives a lot of what we do in terms of how we, how we arrange and how we support the food banks as well.
Thank you. We funded 211 in Louisiana to track the requests that were coming in. And we're able to help Feeding America, Second Harvest Food Bank, to move their locations and support their pantries to move locations in different places where those requests were higher during a disaster. So I think that data is really important. So the question for all of you that I want to go to is to ask, It's from our friend Edward Jones, who says, neither states nor philanthropy can fill the government's proposed gaps during disasters, the current cuts. And the government's also cutting funding in agencies for disaster recovery. So if each of you could say, what should we be telling funders, family members, friends, coworkers, neighbors? What's that one takeaway that you want to leave everybody with? Kavitha, do you want to go first?
Sure. The first thing that popped in my head was preparedness and resilience. I think that we're working with a lot of folks who, for various reasons, are like trust has been lost, I think, with a lot of folks that we're working with, in terms of trust between them and what federal services might be available to them. So I see a huge motion towards um, being able to literally weather the storm themselves, outside of what federal resources may or may not be available. So I think that in terms of talking to funders, talking to your communities, talking to your friends, it's much more about preparation, so that folks can be able to deal with the aftermath and be ready to jump into action when it's needed, because it is a when and not an if.
Absolutely. Salam, do you want to go next?
Yeah, to this point, Feeding America has reported that for every meal that they provide, SNAP provides 9 meals. So it's really important to understand how effective it is and efficient it is to just give families the money for their food budgets. Um, so not only does this help with food insecurity and solve for hunger in that household, but that ripple effect that happens is so important to know. People don't know that SNAP benefits have that ripple effect. So letting them know that every SNAP dollar has up to a $1.80 economic impact during an economic downturn is critical to the conversation. It should be enough that it's helping families with hunger. But of course, we know with good things, with good karma, we have so many more bounties that come as a result of it. And that includes making sure the convenience stores and grocery stores remain open, truck drivers and banks and all these food processors, farmers are also benefiting from this outcome. So letting them know about that efficiency, effective economic impact is crucial, and also letting them know that it's a modest $6.16 per person per day. Really just helps them understand that people are using this for critical needs, and it's a modest benefit that we can improve, and we have increased during the pandemic. So we'll love to get back to that one day.
All right, thanks. And we're almost at time, but Vince, if you could bring us home.
Sure thing. I would say get to know us before you need us. Uh, you know, the local food bank is the heart and soul of Feeding America's operation, but it's also the heart and soul of the community because they're in the community. Our CEO, Claire Fontenot likes to say, not a drop of food comes out of 161 North Clark Street in Chicago. It all happens at the local food bank. So get to know and get engaged with your local food bank uh, in some meaningful way, whether it's volunteering, whether it's donating, whether it's supporting some of the programs. Uh, the SNAP situation is going to have a major impact, as we can all guess from what we've heard here, on how the food banks do business and also how the communities are going to fare under this new situation. So uh, we've got to we got to be creative, we got to be innovative, and we've got to be willing to press the pedal and move forward. My grandfather used to say, my late grandfather used to say, don't spend time worrying about what just happened so you start figuring out what you're going to do next.
It's a great expression. So I think everyone can see why I was so excited to talk to this panel today and to really address this issue, which is an area I've worked in for a long time. I want to share some thoughts that came to me as we wrap up. while I was talking to the panelists in the last few weeks. One is that food access starts with farmers. We may get our food from a grocery store, but it originally came from a farm. So any disaster or change in federal purchasing drastically impacts farmers, which then affects the whole supply chain and our access to food. Address the root causes of hunger, as we heard about today. Food banks and SNAP are helpful, but in many ways they're band-aids to fill gaps in our national food insecurity crisis. So there are solutions for hunger, and we talked about some of those, so help fund those. But then also support SNAP and food banks. So despite what I said about addressing root causes, right now we need SNAP benefits and food banks to help feed the millions of people and the millions of children every day. And until those root causes are funded, we need to support farmers, get SNAP benefits, and support our food banks. This webinar is just one of the many things CDP offers. I really encourage you to check out our website at disasterphilanthropy.org to learn more about what we're doing. And then we're going to continue this conversation about hunger and look at the far extreme of what hunger means and address the growing famine in Sudan, where at least 10 different locations in the country are experiencing famine right now. So I want to thank our co-sponsors, Salam, Vince, and Kavita, for sharing their insights with us. Don't forget to complete the survey. If you have questions, you can email me at a new address, webinars@disasterphilanthropy.org. Thank you and have a great day. Thanks for attending.